just a bit outside.
Welcome into another edition of Nate Hit the Foul Pole. This is our special episode, the post-trade deadline discussion. I am one of your co-hosts, Matthew Pine, alongside Zach Goodman. Zach, how are you?
I'm great, Matt, and Orioles had a nice trade deadline. I'm ready to talk about it.
Yep, and we want to welcome in a friend of ours. He's been on the podcast before, Chris Resetar. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hey guys, I'm really excited to be here. How are you, Matt and Zach?
Doing great. How are you, Chris?
Doing fantastic.
I am doing wonderful. Like Zach said, I'm ready to discuss some prospects. The last time I was here, it was pre-COVID, and so it was very different. We were talking about getting ready for a minor league season, and obviously that didn't happen. But the good news is baseball's back, and we're ready for some. Hopefully we get into a more normal off season, and we can discuss that here in just a minute.
Yep. So a fairly good amount of activity at the trade deadline. I wouldn't say a high flurry, but a good amount of activity, and the Orioles were no exception to that, making 3 trades before the deadline. First trade we want to discuss is the Tommy Milone deal to the Atlanta Braves for a player to be named later. What are you expecting out of this deal, Chris?
Yeah, so obviously with the player to be named later, it's a little bit challenging to determine what type of value, if any, that we got. In terms of what I'm expecting, I expect this to be very similar to the Andrew Cashner deal. I expect that the prospects that the Orioles will get back are likely guys that are a little bit further away. One of the interesting things about the Braves that makes it hard to assess when looking at their system is the Braves have actually been banned from signing any international prospects over $10,000 for the past 2 seasons as a result of the John Coppolella scandal. So they haven't been able to sign as many Dominican or foreign players as they normally would have been able to. So I kind of suspect that it might be like maybe some college draftees that the Orioles wanted that they maybe missed out on, or maybe like some lower-level high school lottery tickets. But to be honest, I wouldn't expect that it would be like anybody that would fall on like a top 30 prospect list, especially for someone like Tommy Milone.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. I don't really expect a huge return here. Obviously, Tommy Milone is more of an innings eater than anything. I'm not really sure why the Braves picked him up to be, a new starter in that rotation, even though the rotation has had injuries and they've had guys that have been sent down, but I guess they needed someone. Tommy Milone didn't really have all that much value to the Orioles, so to get anything for him is kind of nice. But like you said, Andrew Cashner trade kind of makes sense. I was thinking more along the lines of the Jonathan Villar trade. They got a 14th round draft pick in Easton Lucas out of that, a guy that's probably not going to hit any top prospect lists or really be considered a top prospect, but a guy that Mike Elias probably liked coming out of the draft in 2019. So I kind of expect the same things, and we'll see how the Orioles can handle this down the stretch in finding a new starter to eat innings.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add, just for some context, for those who may not be familiar, the trade deadline was a little bit different this year, in the sense that only players on the 60-man roster are allowed, or 60-man roster, either the active roster or the camp roster, are allowed to be traded this year during the season. So that's why you saw all of these players to be named later in these deals. And the only way that they can be announced is if that player is being added to the camp roster. So there have been a couple player to be named laters who have been added or who have been announced by their respective teams because they were being added to the 60-man. But otherwise, it could be as late as November before we really learn, who these players are, what type of status they have, anything like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and maybe we'll hear one or two. We've seen a couple leaks coming across too that there were guys that were not even added and that were just leaked by some reporters who were close to the organizations. But I don't really think we'll hear any of the Orioles get leaked because I really don't think the Orioles are going to be getting guys that would be even added to the 60 man. It just doesn't really make that much sense. So I really don't expect any to be announced, but it's going to be nice in November. The Orioles are going to be getting prospects back from the Velasquez trade and the Blyer trade, and of course these other trades now at the deadline. So it'll be an exciting November.
Chris, can you explain to our audience as best as you can, or as best, I guess, as you're aware of, the whole player to be named later? Like when a team is choosing that player, is it like a pool of players or a range of prospects they choose from?
Yeah, absolutely. So my understanding of the way that the player to be named process works is that the team that's, I guess, conducting the trade or that's giving up players, or I guess obviously both teams are giving up players, but the team that basically the teams agree upon a list of players, and then at the end of the season, the team that is acquiring the player to be named later selects a player from that list to bring into the organization. Now, my understanding is that because of the differences in the rules this year, I think it's very, very likely that the player that's going over is already agreed upon. But in a normal year, a normal sense, usually it's a list of players. But I do know that it's a requirement for the commissioner's office. So obviously, the player to be named later in the Mets trade, the Orioles can't just be like, oh yeah, well, we agreed on their top prospect, and
Right.
The Mets reneged on us. So I do know that there has to be some structure to that's submitted to the commissioner's office there.
Yeah, definitely. Previous years have been a little bit different. I think the player to be named later is almost sort of a loophole that teams can use this year. A thing that they can utilize to get more prospects back and better prospects back. Obviously there have been some solid player to be named laters across the years. David Ortiz was a player to be named later. Michael Brantley. There have certainly been successes there, but it's definitely going to look a little bit different this year. Instead of maybe guys that are a fringe major leaguer and haven't really made it yet, it's more going to be prospects this year. So I'm excited to see who the Orioles can grab.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that I think that this year one of the things to consider is that you may see a higher caliber of player to be named later, and this isn't just for the Orioles, but it is an overall trend. Only because typically player to be named laters are like a throw-in. But as I understand it, there are kind of two reasons for this, and one of the main ones is that they didn't want to have the players travel during all this season. So if they're not going to be on the 60-man pool, there's really not a lot of a reason for them to come to Baltimore just to take a physical and then fly back to wherever they were, So that's my understanding as far as the reasoning behind not allowing trades of guys that are off of the 60-man roster.
All right, and then the second trade we wanted to talk about was the trade with the Colorado Rockies. The Orioles trading Michael Givens and receiving two prospects in return, Taron Vavra, the middle infielder, and Tyler Nevin, the son of former big leaguer Phil Nevin. What do you see out of these prospects, Chris?
Yeah, so my reaction to this trade was a little interesting at first. So I've actually seen both of these guys play. I actually saw Tyler Nevin play last August in the middle of his torrid streak with Hartford. So Tyler Nevin was actually picked, I believe, in the same round of the same draft as current Orioles player Ryan Mountcastle.
Yep.
And Nevin is a guy who at one point was rated as high as the 2 or 3 prospect in the Rockies system. But due to a combination of injuries and the failure to really develop offensively or defensively as expected, a lot of prospect rankings now have him toward the mid-teens, upper 20s. The big thing with Nevin is that he is a excellent hitter with good plate discipline. But when he originally came out of the draft, many people were looking at him as a third baseman. and that really didn't work out. He's not the most coordinated over at third base. There's almost no long-term future there for him. So he ended up as a first baseman left fielder, and while he can still hit, the power is a big question. And obviously at a position where power is valued, I think the big question is, will he hit enough to play those positions full-time in the majors? Ultimately, I think right now he projects more of as maybe like a first baseman, like a second division regular first baseman / backup corner outfielder who can give you a bit of versatility. And that's kind of where I see Tyler Nevin. Did you guys have any thoughts on what you think about him?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with a lot of what you said. I do look at it. It's funny you brought up Ryan Mountcastle, because I do look at their profiles kind of similar, except the plate discipline. Obviously, they're on totally different stratospheres there. Ryan Mountcastle swings at everything, and Nevin's very patient. But Nevin does have a lot of power, so maybe the bat plays at first base. But in general, the first baseman's you're gonna want your guy to hit a little bit more than I think Nevin will. Like you said, third base didn't work out. The Orioles don't have a long-term third baseman that I see really in the system yet. Maybe Jordan Westberg, maybe Gunnar Henderson, but they're far away. And, Nevin's pretty close to the majors. Obviously there's not a spot open in left field with Mountcastle there now. There's not a spot open in right field. There's not really a spot open at first base even yet. So maybe he comes up as a super utility player, someone who can move around and be a backup, like you said, a second division regular. But the question will be, is he going to hit enough? I think that will be the definite question here. Hopefully he can just keep hitting the way he did in the minors.
Absolutely, and it is worth noting that he would have been Rule 5 eligible this past year. So the Rockies actually added him to the 40-man, and so as a result of this trade, he's already on the Orioles 40-man. So he'll be using his second option in 2021. And so while I know that the plan right now is to start him at Norfolk, I think it's definitely possible that we see him in the majors before the end of 2021, assuming he hits.
Yeah, I looked at his numbers. He's a career OPS guy over 800, which is what you want to see. Has a little bit of speed. He's attempted over 40 stolen bases in his minor league career. But yeah, he does profile very similarly to Mountcastle. So, they give him the starting job in Norfolk next year and just see if he can hack it.
I should note, Mountcastle is a much, much, much better hitter.
Definitely.
More power. I think with Nevin, where you're really going to see some struggles is that he's a guy that has some I would say at least average power, maybe a bit above average, but it hasn't really translated to hitting a lot of home runs yet, whereas Mountcastle has more of a power stroke and gets the ball over the fence with more consistency. So it's just a note to compare the two. So.
And what do you see out of Terrin Vavra?
Yeah, so Terrin Vavra is actually a really interesting prospect because I saw him 3 times this year. Vavra is a 23-year-old infielder who played at the University of Minnesota. And as an avid Ohio State Buckeyes fan, I had actually seen him a bit on the Big Ten Network prior to the draft. And the thing about Vavra, when I saw him in the minors last year with Asheville, is that he really didn't stand out. And as someone that's seen a lot of minor league players, that can be a good thing, or it can be that can be actually a good thing. And the reason is because that means that they're doing all of the things that they are supposed to do. Like Tyler Nevin, Vavra also has some baseball bloodlines. His dad is actually the hitting coach for the Detroit Tigers. And interestingly enough, Vavra has a swing that's very Major League-esque. It's got that little bit of an uppercut to it. He tries to meet the ball on its way up. He drives the ball well, and the hit tool will definitely be kind of his carrying tool. But he's a guy that you're probably looking at, 40, 45, 50 grades across the board. He's not really going to wow you with any of his tools right now. And ultimately, I think that he ends up at second base because his arm, I don't know if it'll play well enough to be third or to be shortstop long term. The big question I think that Vavra has right now is that he did spend the entirety of the 2019 minor league season at Asheville, and he was about 2 years older than the average, 1 to 2 years older than the average prospect in that league. So while he did win the MVP, he was doing it against generally younger competition. Um, younger competition. So I think I could see him as a guy that maybe skips the level and starts at Bowie next year. Um, but I look at him ultimately as a guy that has a high floor, but a relatively limited ceiling. I think that he's potentially a bat first starting second baseman at his ceiling, and his floor is more of a utility guy. But I think that he is probably the most surefire major leaguer of the two.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what you said. But Chris, you and I talked about this the other day, actually, about teams promoting prospects from single A before they even reach double A or triple A, and this might be the same thing that happens with the Vavra. The Orioles, he's already 23. They might just promote him once they feel that bat is ready, because it does look like it's ready. He's putting up great numbers. One of my favorite parts about him is that his plate discipline is so good. He walked as many times as he struck out last year. It was exactly a 1-to-1 ratio, which is fantastic. You can't complain about that at all. He's going to hit for average, maybe a little bit of power. He's going to get on base, which is great. I definitely think that the Orioles could view him as the long-term second baseman if he can hit well enough for that, and if he can play defense well enough there. I do agree with you. He's not a shortstop. I haven't seen him in person, but everything I've read says that his defense is not ready for there. But yeah, the Orioles don't have a lot of guys in the minor league system that profile as a starting second baseman down the stretch. So I like Vavra's profile a lot. I heard about him when he won MVP, and I was very impressed with his numbers. This is a great pickup for me. I love this one.
One other thing to note about this trade as a whole is every one of the trades the Orioles made, they got a player to be named later. I would say that I generally expect that with this trade, the player to be named later, I'm not sure where it's going to lie, because I think that the Orioles got a little bit better of a deal than I was expecting for Michael Givens. I have to give Michael Elias a lot of credit. He definitely got the deal that he wanted out of this. But I am very curious about the player to be named later in this trade, just because I don't really know what to expect in terms of the quality of it. Because it seems like the Orioles already got a lot of quality out of this deal. So I don't know, where we're going with that. So it'll be interesting to watch and see how that plays out.
There's a Twitter account that measures the value between MLB trades, and they actually measured the value in this one, and they called it a landslide value victory for the Orioles. That even despite who this player to be named later could be, they really won this trade just based on getting two guys that were pretty high up in a bad system like the Rockies, but they were still pretty high up there, and a lot of scouts really like these two guys. I agree with you on the player to be named later. I'm not sure who it could be, but I like I said, or like you said, I don't think it's going to be that good. It's not. It doesn't scream, incredible value based on who the Orioles already got.
Yeah. Now, Vavra is a bit divisive, I should point out. I've seen Vavra as high as the 6th prospect in the Rockies system. If you look at places like Pipeline, I know Jonathan Mayo is very high on him. But Baseball America actually has him down in the 20s. They weren't sold on the level of competition, as well as that the power would play as well as it did, as Asheville is one of the better hitters parks in the Low A Sally League.
So I did notice that as well. That was going to be my next question. Can you explain, from your understanding, the difference in thought processes, evaluations between Pipeline and Baseball America?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with guys like Vavra and even Nevin to an extent, it depends on how well you think that their tools will play. Pipeline, I've noticed, tends to be more bullish on guys that have higher draft pedigree. So guys like Nevin and Vavra that, were first, Nevin was a first rounder, Vavra was a third rounder. They tend to be higher on those guys. And I did listen to some commentary by Jonathan Mayo that he really believes strongly in the hit tool for Vavra, but not as much as not as much in it with Nevin. So he rated him higher, whereas I think Baseball America felt like that Nevin was the higher rated prospect because he was finally healthy last year. He started to show why he was a first rounder, whereas Vavra again was above his level, above average age for his level, and so I think that they were looking at it from that perspective and basically saying, not that we don't like Vavra, but we want to see a little bit more.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair point. Obviously there are a lot of rankings that can differ, and I know, Chris, yourself, you don't really look at rankings too much. You look more at the talent of the player, and that's certainly something I think that applies here. I'm personally more of a fan of Vavra myself. I haven't seen either of them in person, but the stuff I read and the tools that I see they have, Vavra just looks like more of a long-term starting player, and I do see him as having more of a spot on the O's down the road. So I prefer Vavra.
Gotcha.
And the third and final trade the Orioles made was with the New York Mets, signing Miguel Castro, the relief pitcher, to the Mets for pitcher Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith, a big guy, 6'5", 200 pounds. What do you see from Kevin Smith, Chris?
So, Kevin Smith is really interesting, and actually, right now, obviously there's another player to be named later in this Castro trade, yep. So we don't know who that is yet. But as of right now, this is actually my favorite trade the Orioles made. And I say that from two perspectives. First, I'm not a person that really buys that Castro had turned it around. Now, watch me be wrong there, and Castro becomes a dominant reliever for the Mets, because he definitely has the stuff to do that.
Definitely.
That slider can be downright nasty at times. But in terms of Smith, he's a guy that I got to see twice last year after he moved up to Double-A. Around, I believe it was in July last year, he moved up. What I compared Smith to on my Twitter was a better version, in my opinion, of Zach Lowther. And what I mean by that is Smith throws a little bit harder than Lowther. He has a high spin fastball that sits in the low 90s, probably the 90 to 92 range. His put away pitch is a slider, a pretty solid slider that he throws. And I think that the big question with Smith is going to be, can he get righties out with consistency? If you watch his video right now, you really don't see him throw his changeup, which is his third pitch, very much. And that's a little bit concerning for his profile as a starter. But I think the two pitches he has are better than, like, say, the best two pitches that Zach Lowther has. But if you want to compare the two, Zach Lowther has a more refined repertoire. He can throw a fastball changeup curve, but they're at lower velocities, and I don't think they're quite as good. So I would say that Kevin Smith could be a theoretical, another high floor, low ceiling guy, where he could be anywhere from a effective, middle relief pitcher to a 4 or 5 starter if he's able to develop that changeup and get righties out more consistently.
Yeah, he definitely could become that 4 or 5 starter. I know the Mets GM said that organization viewed him as a number 5 starter, so there's certainly potential there. I think the big question is, will his stuff play in the majors? We just don't know yet. Obviously Zach Lowther's a guy that we really are questioning that, and there are a lot of guys in the Orioles organization like that. Alex Wells is another one. Keegan Aiken's another one. And he's a solid pickup. Being a lefty, he can really face lefties. Only a .207 batting average from lefties last year. Really low slugging, really low on base. So he might become a lefty specialist. But a 4 or 5 starter looks to be a possibility for him for sure. Like you said, he really uses 2 pitches mainly, and neither of them are overpowering. But he might become a solid finesse pitcher who throws in the low 90s and gets a lot of outs, and that would be solid.
Yeah, what I noticed from Smith, he's got really low career whip, 1.17. He strikes out more than a batter an inning. So it's promising, and for what it's worth, take pipeline rankings for what they are, but they rank Kevin Smith as the best prospect of the three, putting him in at number 12 on the Orioles' top 30. Vavra checks in at number 13, and Tyler Nevin checks in at number 23.
I'll be honest, I think there are guys I like better than Kevin Smith that are a little bit lower. Just based on having seen them a little bit more. There are a couple guys that I'd prefer. Even Vavra, I'd probably prefer a little bit over Smith. But, if he can become a 5-starter, there's certainly a ton of value to be had there.
Funny enough, it's funny that you say that, mainly because I also like Pipeline. In this scenario, agree that Kevin Smith is the best player that the Orioles acquired in any of the deals that they did to this point. But I actually think that you could make an easy argument, depending on how much you like a guy like Zach Lowther at 11. I think you could make an argument for Kevin Smith at the back of the top 10 for the Orioles.
Wow.
Even above a guy like Dean Kramer.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's bold, Chris. That's bold.
Well, there's a number of guys, in the Orioles' top 10, like for Pipeline right now. Like I'm looking at the list that I could re-rank. But as you said, I'm not a huge fan of stack ranking prospects. I look at prospects more on like a tier basis, like where your tier ones are your like really elite prospects, like your Adley Rutschman and your Grayson Rodriguez, and maybe your DL Hall or Heston Kjerstad might fit in that category. And then, like, your second tier is guys that have a solid chance at being regulars, but could also be something lower than that. So there's definitely ways that I might reorganize the Orioles' top 10 a little bit if you force me to rank them. But that's a topic for another day because I know we're coming up on our time here.
Are there any players that you're surprised by that the Orioles didn't trade? And if not, are there any that you could see them being dealt in the wintertime?
Absolutely. So I think that the biggest name that I would look at to be dealt potentially in the winter would be Hanser Alberto. Now, obviously, with Hanser Alberto, he's a guy that the analytics don't love. He doesn't hit the ball super hard, although he's hitting it better this year. But I think that at the deadline, a lot of teams have a different mindset. It seemed that this deadline that there was a clear focus on relief pitching, unless you were the Padres and just acquired everybody that you could get your hands on. But I think that a guy like a Hanser Alberto really right now, he's the main guy that I could see the Orioles looking to move in the offseason. Maybe a guy like Pedro Severino, if you think that Rutschman will be ready next year, and the Orioles are willing to push him, considering service time and everything. But I would say that it's more likely that position players move in the offseason. The only other guy that I can really think of would be potentially Alex Cobb, but I think that Alex Cobb looked more appealing this year because of the fact that you only had to pay him his prorated salary, and he's going to be a lot harder to trade this off season. With you being on the hook for the $12 million or whatever salary he's owed next year.
I got to be honest, I'm a little disappointed that the Orioles did not trade Severino. I think right now his value is about as high as it will ever be, and he's hitting the ball so well. His defense is obviously a little bit shaky, but that's a story for a different day. His bat's just so good, and his value's so high, and he has a couple of years of control left, and it would have been a solid move at the time. I think they could have gotten back a haul. I mean, look what the Mariners got for Austin Nola. Not really that great of a player. He's fine. He's good. But, I think Severino has a little bit more value than Nola personally. That's my personal belief. And I think the Orioles could have gotten a really nice haul for him. I do think they may look at trading him at the offseason, maybe at the winter meetings. It just kind of makes sense. With Adley Rutschman coming up and then Chance Sisco is now finally hitting the ball well. You might re-sign Brian Holiday, have him be the backup until Adley Rutschman comes up. But they might have a logjam pretty soon at catcher once Adley Rutschman comes up. And, if you can get a lot for Pedro Severino, I definitely think you pull the trigger. On Alex Cobb, I do agree with you, Chris. I don't really see him moving in the offseason. I thought the Orioles' best chance was now. He's pitching well, and teams could always use a starter. Obviously, he wouldn't have come cheap, but you never know what a team could acquire. Lance Lynn was looking at being traded. Not really a big starting pitching deadline for any teams at that point, but Alex Cobb could definitely go in the offseason, but I don't really see it. And Hanser Alberto's a guy that I think the Orioles will definitely take calls on, but I don't, being the analytics where they are and StatCast numbers, like you said, the exit velocities aren't very high, and he's really doesn't have a great glove either. I don't really see the Orioles getting a huge deal back for him either.
One thing to consider, real quick, Zach, just in terms of the Nola trade, I think that it's worth noting that the Padres and the Mariners made a trade where the Padres got a ton of guys with control back, and I was reading the other day that since Austin Nola became a regular back last year at catcher, he actually has the second highest WAR of any catcher in the major leagues, or something insane like that, from a guy that literally was a minor league free agent signing. But he's actually kept it up for the second year in a row. Nola kind of reminds me a little bit of I don't know if you would compare them quite the two, but of a Mike Yastrzemski, a guy that was acquired really under the radar. But the biggest difference with Nola, and I think part of his value too, is the fact that Nola can play 5 different positions. He came up as a shortstop. Apparently, the Padres are planning on, since they also acquired another catcher, Jason Castro, from the Angels, they're actually planning on having Nola potentially play first base, second base, potentially third, the corner outfields, and catcher. So I think that you aren't potentially, with Nola, they could move him around, and I think that adds to his value. And he's considered a good defensive catcher. Whereas obviously Severino is not at all. So,
yeah, that's a fair point for sure. And obviously they still have Francisco Mejia back there, so they do have their 2 catchers in Hedges is now in Cleveland, but they have Mejia there too as well, and Nola can play around. And I get that they have the control. They got a lot of guys with control back, but giving up Taylor Trammell is a big move. I mean, that's certainly a all-in kind of move. I'm not, maybe the Orioles don't get a Taylor Trammell, but I think they could have gotten something pretty good.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I'm not super high on Taylor Trammell.
That's fair.
I think he's one of those guys that I think is now he's only 22, so take this for what it's worth. But I don't view Taylor Trammell I view him as a potential guy that could be one of those superstar athletes that never really develops the baseball skills that you expect. Kind of maybe an Anthony Alford with the Blue Jays, who just got claimed by the Pirates. I could see Trammell ending up in a situation like that where you're like, man, I can't believe he didn't turn out better than he was. You know what I mean?
Yeah, maybe the ceiling's there like a Victor Robles, but the floor would be an Anthony Alford. Would you kind of agree with that?
Not quite. I don't think that Victor Robles is his ceiling. I think his ceiling is lower than Victor Robles. I think that Victor Robles can be an absolute superstar.
Yeah, he could be.
If everything breaks right, I don't see Trammell as that type of prospect. But Trammell could certainly be a regular outfielder, but I don't see him as an all-star or anything like that. So.
Well, Chris, we appreciate your time as always. Is there anything that we can plug for you? You have a lot of good tweets coming out and explaining some of these moves. We can plug your Twitter account for you.
Yeah. So you can find me just by searching Chris Resetar. That's Resetar. You can just if you like the O's, you can follow me. I also comment just generally on prospects. So I don't currently write for anybody or anything like that, but I do sometimes post my thoughts out there just to get opinions. And, thank you guys again for having me on.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back anytime. You've got a lot of prospect knowledge, and we always appreciate your opinion.
Of course, and I hope that once player to be named later stops becoming so popular that we can figure out who player to be named later is and maybe finally talk about him.
Yeah, for sure.
Sounds good.
Appreciate you coming on.
All right, take care, guys.
Thank you.
All right. So that will conclude this special edition of Nate Hit the Valpole. And big thanks again to Chris Resetar for coming on. Always a wealth of knowledge when it comes to prospects. We will resume our normal episode next week. And thanks so much for listening. And we'll see you next week.